Thanks, Paul, and thanks for hosting David's visit with us. It's been a great partnership. Well, last night we talked about what I call the focusing question for this series, which is, what does it mean to be a human being? A sinner, saint or machine? And I said that it's very much the question for our time. I'm not the only person saying this. Some of you would have enjoyed Ian Provan, whom we brought out from Regent College, and recently Ian sent me an email to say exactly that this is the question for Christians. This is the number one, and we have to have views, and the views have to be informed and developed. So I think this topic is relevant, and the way that we're approaching it, I'm repeating what I said last night, but I think it's worthwhile repeating it, is as a developing argument. 5 modules, and the 5 modules are sequenced, and they're sequenced logically. We will unashamedly finish today with the high point, the highest vision for humanity that civilization has developed, the patristic concept of theosis. It's so breathtakingly positive and yet so orthodox to Christianity. The phrase "in Christ" is the most common phrase in the New Testament, that very few people have investigated it, and we will investigate it, riding on the back of some great minds like Maximus and Gregory of Nyssa. That's how we'll end. In a sense, we began last night at the dark side of the moon, which is this growing worldview zeitgeist about the mind being a machine. I don't think anyone quite completely believes it, but it's influencing everybody. I mean, many years ago, I was the Nuremberg Chair of Design at Carnegie Mellon University. Carnegie Mellon University, one of the top universities in America, is one of the homes of artificial intelligence and cognitive science. And I was having a conversation with Herb Simon, who was the Nobel Prize winner there, who's since passed away, and with Arthur Newell. They claim to be the first people to have developed what was then a human reasoning machine. His words to me is, quote unquote, "the mind is a machine." I completely disagreed with him. He wasn't the kind of dogmatic person who closed down a debate, but it's something seeping in to the Christian mind. Sorry, not the Christian mind, to the mind of the world. We finished last night with David, I think, taking us on quite a mesmerising journey to critique the assumptions behind that. But we ended on a positive note, what David calls the incommensurable qualities of mind, that we cannot actually ever reduce. And furthermore, it went further than that, which, David, I was personally blessed, where we, as it were, took off and said not only are our individual qualities of mind incommensurable, that we're sharing in the mind of God. We didn't invent mind. It's something we are participating in David's words, top down. And we ended with intent as one of the unity of consciousness and intent were two of the big qualities that really by which we seem to be sharing in the mind of God. Now, that leads to this morning's first module, which is, has the church dropped the ball on that by an overemphasis on the doctrine of original sin? I actually think that's true. I mean, I feel that the Christian anthropology that I hear most is the first thing we want to tell people is they're sinners. It's not a great starting point for a conversation, but the question is, have we overemphasised that? And that's what we're going to look at today. The doctrine that became in Calvin's hands, total depravity. Now, I just want to frame this before we get going with David. And I want to say that there's no question that there are two major competing streams of thought in the Christian tradition. No question. And I think it's well summed up. Some of you might know that one of David's heroes, I think, David, you consider Bulgakov the greatest theologian of the 20th, 21st century. I'm just getting into him, but your pupil, I guess, Roberto Della Naval, wrote, if you want to actually have a go at Bulgakov, you could begin with the Spiritual Diary or the essays on the sociology of death. But I just wanted to read you just a fraction from what's called the theological introduction. Bulgakov had a mesmerisingly positive vision of being made in the image of God. And unlike almost anyone in history, he pursued that. It's quite amazing and mind-expanding and faith-expanding to read. But in the introduction, they make this comment: so vaulting an anthropology was destined to draw criticism. How could such an emphasis on humanity's divinity not obscure the doctrine of humanity's sinfulness? And a colleague of his, Bulgakov's, Badaev, if I said that right or wrong, Nikolai Badaev, sums it up by this. Badaev puts his finger directly on the question: is creation or fall, creativity or redemption, the centre of gravity for Christian anthropology and for an understanding of Christian mission in the world? I think that puts it starkly. We don't, and so the inquiry that we're setting off on is charting a course in that. And the other thing I wanted to mention, by way of an introduction, which I'd recommend, is Karl Barth's short article called The Humanity of God. The title will tell you that's an extraordinary title, The Humanity of God. What's interesting is the most significant Reformed theologian in many ways of the 20th century wrote this or it was a speech actually, toward the end of his life. And the first half of the article is an extended mea culpa. We have gone too far on the doctrine of sin, and we have diminished the doctrine of being made in the image of God. He goes a lot further than that. So I commend that to you. So that's the framework. And I think in order to focus on this today, we'll focus on particularly two competing attitudes to the will, which is where we ended last night. You know, if intention and will is, as it were, the queen of our cognitive faculties, what draws us closest to God, the question is, can the will desire the good, or will the will inevitably desire the bad? So we'll begin by looking at, in a sense, we've framed this as a competing ideas between St. Augustine, complex character, we'll talk about him in a moment, and his legacy that grew, I suppose, with an increasingly dark view of the will, and the contrast with Nicholas of Cusa. Now, Nicholas is not technically, of course, a patristic because he was born in 1401, but this extraordinary book, The Vision of God, offers a completely contrasting view, and that's what we're going to talk to David about. He knows far more about both of those views than we do, or I do, certainly. It's a good thing about me asking questions, David, is I don't have to have all the answers. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi. How are you feeling today, David?
I'm well. How are you?
Pretty good. I enjoyed last night. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Can we give David a round of applause and welcome? St. Augustine, complex character. Could you give us a snapshot of possibly his journey? Because, I mean, he possibly lived too long, that's your view, but with his developing view of human sinfulness, original sin, and because there isn't one view that, there isn't one St. Augustine view on those matters, I gather.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, he is the most complex, fascinating, and infuriating figure in Christian history. I often think he was a towering genius. He simply was. He created whole genres not only of literature but of thought. I mean, there's nothing like The City of God is a late work, so it's already, so let's say, contaminated by that darker view. But no one before had ever thought in these terms, had ever constructed a kind of genealogy of culture according to the structures of desire and at the threshold between immanent and transcendent ends, and it was simple, and with a subtlety that just no one. So the one thing one can't say about Augustine is, oh, he was a fool, or he was simple-minded about this, or he thought in crude categories. He was also a person, though, I mean, I think even when you read the Confessions, you realize that there's a certain kind of well, I don't want to say psychopathology, so I'll say psychopathology. There, in that he had an extraordinary capacity for a sense of his own unworthiness and his guilt. And today, where we're somewhat more lenient in our psychologization of our motives and the motives of others, we couldn't agonize as he did over the memory of stealing a pear when he was a boy. But for him, it was indicative of the corruption of the will at a very deep level. Though the pear itself was good, I mean, he believed that you could only ultimately desire the good. You could do it in such a distorted way that you could long for the good under the form simply of the excitement of stealing something that's not yours. And for him, this, and it was it's a very acute reflection on the kind of mixed motives with which we conduct ourselves in every sphere. But this becomes more and more pronounced as the years go along in his debates with the Pelagians, and especially Julian of Eclanum, because more and more he felt, and part of this is I have to say, to a greater degree than most people want to acknowledge, an issue of translation. I mean, the words in which he thought, the Latin words in which he thought and read Scripture, he never really mastered Greek. Late in life, he could read it a bit. So, I mean, for instance, he was in the habit of thinking of sin not just as debitum, but as culpa, real guilt. And that's not really a word that you find in the Greek New Testament. I mean, speaks of our debts, our ophilimata and transgressions, but the notion of guilt and inherited guilt is not really prominent, because the legal metaphors that Paul uses have to do with civil law, and they all have to do with the laws for manumitting slaves, for the most part. Things we call ransom in our translations actually for Paul would mean just the manumission fee you were obliged to pay to buy someone out of slavery by law. So part of it's translation, but part of it is more and more this sense that there had to be an opposition between grace and nature, for grace really to be gracious. What grace gives you, more and more he became convinced, because again, he was painting himself rhetorically into a corner in his struggles with the Pelagians, who were said to teach the free will is capable of earning God's wrath or mercy. More and more, in order to assure that grace that the gratuity of grace be preserved against any possible dilution of that one must say that's almost opposed to what nature is capable of, opposed to what nature merits. And this set the pattern for much of Western theology. We are born guilty, not just in a state of sin. I mean, the Eastern Church, the Eastern Fathers would say, yes, we're born in a servitude, bondage to death, corruption, but they talk about it as a kind of weakness or sickness or an inherited condition of disease. And part of it also, of course, again, translation. I mean, sostheni. I mean, the verb that becomes salvation, and this is true in Latin too, but it was more obvious in Greek, has as its root meaning being healed, being made whole, being made hale, not just rescued, but restored to your natural condition.
Well, while we're just talking about that,
I'm
Dave,
going on and on. Yes,
I know that.
Sorry about that.
David, in our conversations, when you weren't watching the baseball, which I know is very, are the Orioles playing at the moment?
Orioles are ahead 2-0 in the bottom of
For those of you who are worried.
in the second inning. Yeah. Go on. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks for reminding me.
That's okay. I want to keep your mind on the job. And you made a telling comment when we were discussing just the word sin. And you actually said that were you to do a third edition of your translation of the New Testament, you would consider not using SIN to translate the Greek.
Yeah. Well, because I think the word has become, for us, is loaded with the connotation of just guilt, first and foremost. And there is there is culpability, there is responsibility for your actions, obviously in the New Testament, but the word amartia really means, it has a weaker sense, error, missing the mark, not, being, so there's errancy as much as there is culpability. Sin for us, I think sin for us simply means something, we think we understand what the term means, and as a result I think it obscures the kind of arguments that are made in Paul's epistles and elsewhere, and about the relationship between sin and law, sin and grace, sin and incorporation into Christ. So I'm not sure what I would use in its place. Maybe errancy. I'd have to think about it.
Mm. Yeah. Well, just to summarise what you told us about St. Augustine. I mean, he did live a very long life, and he wrote a great deal. People even talk about the early Augustine and the later Augustine as if they're almost two different authors.
Oh, actually, almost three, really. The very early of the soliloquies, then the great golden period of the Confessions and De Trinitate and things like that, and then the late Augustine, who's concerned with grace and guilt, of De Corruptione and all that, and finally the retractions. So yeah, he goes through three distinct periods.
Yes, in which De Trinitate, it always feels to me kind of the purest of works. I don't know. What do you think about that?
De Trinitate?
Yeah.
Oh, I think it's a work. It's just a work of genius. Again, thinking at a level and a depth that was just almost unprecedented in his time, with a subtlety, and again finding different analogies for the Trinity that have this splendid way not only of illuminating what he's talking about, so that you don't mistake it for, a confederation of three individuals getting together and deciding to be God, but also that it then casts a light out. Because it illuminates the things that he makes analogies from, like the structure of the mind. So yeah, I put it with the greatest of Plato's dialogues, for instance, in the history of Western thought.
Mm. But unfortunately, and this does happen to all of us as we get older, we can get crankier. And he was, Bulgakov, in his wonderful essay on St. Augustine, makes the comment that Augustine was polemical and tended to develop his ideas in, as you said, in a debate, and that almost made him exaggerate his ideas. We all tend to do that. That was one point you made, and the other point you made was really he was, as great as he was, struggling with whatever you want to call it, a pathology and obsession with guilt and unworthiness.
There was a morbidity of temper in him that's there from the beginning. I should point out that for 9 or 10 years before he became a Christian, he was a Manichaean, which is a totally dualistic picture of reality. There really is a principle of good and a principle of evil at war with one another. And so, I mean, that's an extremely dark system of thought, even though it has a happy ending. But
would I be wrong to see the vestiges of that even in the City of God, which is a fairly...
No, I think you would be right. Lovers of Augustine get angry when you make this suggestion sometimes, but I think it's clear that dualism never totally released its grip on his imagination.
Yes.
So the city of God, just so what it means, the city of God and the earthly city are posed over against one another so starkly at times in that work that it does amount almost to a cosmic dualism.
Yeah, yeah. Now, but the other point you made, which I think is a real legacy of his, is this sense that in order to maximize the sense of God's grace, I have to maximize the sense of my unworthiness.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Bulgakov once he said also in passing, it's not what it just said in passing, that it was a curious thing to him that between the Eastern and Western traditions, and he was living in Paris at the time, I mean, because of course after the revolution he was not, life in Russia wasn't that great for priests, and was he was in constant conversation with Thomists, and the Thomists of France at that time were what are called manualist Thomists, so they're very Augustinian in many of their premises. And he just remarked to one of them that to him it was a curious thing that in the Eastern tradition, in order to cast light upon the graciousness of grace, the Eastern Fathers would emphasize that it was the fulfillment of nature, that it was in perfect continuity with the nature of the creature, and that the nature of creation was always from the first oriented to grace. Whereas in the West, in order to affirm the gratuity of grace, just the opposite came to be and this was especially true of the Thomists he was arguing with. There's a very special tradition there that grace and nature somehow had to be absolutely discontinuous and almost opposed principles.
We're not going to focus on Bulgakov, but I think for most people here, they probably don't know who he is. Could you just give us just a quick touch of who he was, why you think he's so important, how his reputation's rising these days?
Yeah, he was, well, he came from a very prominent family that included some very famous bishops, and also one of his distant cousins was the great novelist Mikhail Bulgakov, as a master in Margarita. The Bulgakovs were a very educated family, but he in his youth was a Marxist economic philosopher, one of the great economic philosophers actually of ever, if you read his early books on the philosophy of economy. But he was always interested in questions of faith and religion, and he had what really turned his life in the direction it would take was the death of his son. The death of one of his sons. And at the funeral, which was a church funeral, he had a mystical experience of his son transfigured in the glory of Christ, which he believed was it wasn't just a psychological episode. It really was a gift. He had really been granted a knowledge that turned his life, and so thereafter, and what happened there also is he produced, to my mind, the most brilliant body of theological work since Maximus the Confessor. There's not a single figure, with the possible exceptions of Nicholas of Cusa, I think I would say produced so much, such rich theological work for the better part of Christian history, mostly because he had two great virtues. One was he was unafraid of ecclesial authority. I mean, he didn't mind criticizing the traditional theology, even of the church. He would even criticize the church fathers, which in the Eastern Christian world is something you very rarely dare to do. It's like criticizing God. You're supposed to think the church fathers all agreed on everything and were right about everything, whereas he was quite happy to treat them as theologians. You would learn from them, but you could debate them. The other thing is he just had the most incredibly rigorous mind. He would write in this sort of rich, rhapsodic, Silver Age Russian style, but when you follow the argumentation, it was peerless in its consistency and rigor and depth. So yes, he, to my mind, just towers over the rest of theological literature in the modern age.
And now becoming much more translated into English.
Yeah, for years people had a very limited notion of him. They knew he was something called a sophiologist, and they kind of thought they knew what this meant. He must think that there's a fourth hypostasis in the Godhead that's named Sophia. You know, they had these and only 2 or 3 of his books had been translated at that part. And most people in the West don't read Russian, right? Now, over the past 20 years, I like to think, in part through the encouragement of a lot of people I know, friends of mine, myself too, something like 25 of his major books have now been brought into English, and it's started something of a Bulgakov movement in the Anglophone theological world. It's very much changed the conversation on a lot of things. He's actually now the cutting edge of a lot of Anglophone theology.
And just to finish with St. Augustine, of course, his influence on the Reform movement very directly to Luther and Calvin. He was their major influence.
Yeah, oh yeah. All the theology of the 16th century and 17th century, with only a few exceptions, is just late Augustine. And it's not just the Protestant, it's Catholic thought too. Jansenism, neo-scholastic Thomism. There was a huge, it was as if the Catholics and Protestants were trying to outdo one another on the ferocity of God. You know, well, my God is so gracious that 99% of you are going to hell. You know, well, 99.4, as Thomas would say. So, I mean, it was very much the flavor of the time. And again, it was a rhetorical, it's interesting, it's a polemical context. Just as Augustine was debating the Pelagians, so it was Catholic and Reformed or evangelical or evangelisch Christians were trying to outdo one another in extreme formulations of the gratuity of grace. And this creates not just, it's not just, if anyone ever wants to have an experience every bit as horrifying as Book 3 of the Institutes, pick up the Catholic Thomist Garrigou Lagrange's book on predestination. It's amazing. It is good, rigorous Thomist work. It's called Predestination in English. That's not what it was called in the original French. But this is something of a classic text in that tradition. And basically, it's just straightforward double predestinarianism, just inflected with more subtlety through Thomistic language. So it's not just the Reform. I mean, yeah.
And of course, this is accumulating indirectly but massively into an anthropology, a description of what it is to be a human being that, however you frame it, is fairly dark. So in contrast, let's move now to a very contrasting view. Nicholas of Cusa, I first came across his name actually in Miroslav Volf's book on Islam, and where he said, well, Nicholas was unique in his day, the 15th century, 1400s, in having a very Iranic, benevolent attitude with Islam. He was in discourse with them. That's when I first came across him. But of course, since then, I've begun to read him myself. What you say about him, by the way, the particular book I'd recommend is this one, The Vision of God. That'd be a good starting one.
Yeah, it's also known as On the Icon or On the True Image. They're different. I've never seen that edition before, so I don't know which translation it is. But yeah, that's
yeah, and it's accessible. I mean, it's succinct. But can you give us a bit of background on Nicholas? Most of us here would not be familiar with him. Can you give us a bit?
Well, I mean, he represents. I mean, as you may know, as the Reform was taking root in the 16th century, it's also the period of the Italian Renaissance and the revival of Platonism in the West as a result of contact with the collapsing Byzantine Empire, right? More and more through Venice and Palermo and through the Council of Florence, what was going, of course, as many of you know, in 1453, Constantinople fell and the Roman Empire came to its final end. But that led to a huge migration of texts and such westward. So there was a Platonic, but also a Christian, Eastern Christian, Neoplatonic Renaissance in Florence and elsewhere. And part of the Council of Florence, which was an attempt to unite East and West, to which the Eastern Church came because they needed military assistance, to be honest, against the Ottomans. It was actually Nicholas of Cusa, who was this prominent clergyman in Germany, Cues, is what Cusa being the Latin for Cues. He actually was the one who led the delegation to Constantinople that brought back such figures to the council as Bessarion and George Camistus Plethon and other great scholars. And they, in time, would bring their libraries with them. For instance, Bessarion he didn't go back to the captive Byzantine world. He became a cardinal and had his whole library given to the Venetian Senate. Okay, so, but with Nicholas, he also, on the ship back from Constantinople again, had a vision. It was sort of like Bulgakov, in which he realized that everything that exists in a radical way that he hadn't formerly conceived exists within God, in both its existence and its essence. In God, in, of course, the perfect plenitude and simplicity, and in us, what he would call unfoldings of that which is enfolded in God. So he basically had a radical vision of the indistinction between the natural and the gracious. And, we don't know if this is because of the conversations he was having with Eastern Christians or not, or if it's just a coincidence. It would be a strange coincidence. But whatever, you will not find in his work after that, and that's, of course, what he began really writing. The first work after that is called On Learned Ignorance, De Docta Ignorantia, in which he introduced all sorts of new terms into the theological vocabulary at the time, like the coincidentia oppositorum, as being a definition of God, coincidence of opposites, and explaining how this becomes an ontology in which things that differ here below, say like Christianity and Islam, can be understood as in their a non-differentiation in their final ends in God. And his theology thereafter. I think he's just a towering genius, really the most brilliant Christian mind of the 15th century and for many centuries. You're not going to find a discourse of sin as inherited guilt. Nowhere is nature posed over against grace. He never presumes that an opposition between them. For him, it's the integrity of them. In a sense, nature and grace are one and the same thing, is seen from different ends, from the creaturely or divine vantage. So it's nature all the way up, grace all the way down.
Yeah, and we'll finish off by digging a bit deeper in some of his views, just to give people a taste of them, because it could sound superficially like he's just got an optimistic view of human nature, but it's not like that at all. It's extremely sophisticated. But just to give people a taste of it, it's his view of the will, and I've just got a single sentence here, David, where he's saying that every single person only ever seeks the good, and the good is God. So the sentence is, all seekers seek only the good, and every seeker after the good who withdraws from you withdraws from what he is seeking. Could you just can you just comment on that, his view that we are all desiring the good?
Quick. In one sense, this was just the common affirmation. Even Augustine would tell you that. It's the degree of corruption separating us from that end. For Nicholas, if we were so corrupt that that end were not already implicit in all of our motives, then we could have no rational existence at all, right? So for him, every desire for a finite end is sustained by a premise one and could not exist but for a prior desire for an infinite good. So that even our natural, obviously we can't go into the analysis of that, though he argues it brilliantly. He doesn't use the word intention, he uses the word attention, which includes in both intention and something. But anyway, what that means is even the most ordinary impulses of the will and mind have to be understood within light of a prior predisposition of grace to deification, to union with God, and that therefore, if we create a partition between the gracious gift of deification, which in Thomist tradition, the next century will come to mean something that has no continuity with your nature. It's pure superaddition. Then our nature is inexplicable. It's just, again, he takes the notion that the breath of God makes us living souls, the Spirit of God within us, the image of God within us is our nature, the foundation of our nature, which can have no end but union with God in the divine nature. And
I love his, no need to go into this in detail, but the tree, chapter 7, I turn my mind to the nut tree, a big tall tree, and seek to perceive its principle. And off he goes on the tree, and he's ending up finding God behind the tree.
The desire to know the principle of a tree can only reach its satiation in the knowledge of God, because it's that search for the knowledge of God which makes it possible to desire to know a tree.
Yes, and I actually like his word attention rather than intention, because when you discuss this, you make the point that, attention's interesting. So we are paying attention all the time. We're noticing things, but that combines probably two things that he develops. So one is some degree of intentionality, but the other is perception, that there's a cognitive ordering that we're doing all the time.
He's sort of the first phenomenologist. He's Edmund Husserl's great-great-great-grandfather, so to speak. Sophisticated grasp of cognition. But the one that intrigued me most is his view of what we call infinity. Now, I'm used to the term infinity as some kind of merely numerical, quantitative thing, Einstein. But what you write, this intriguing statement about his significance in the history of Western metaphysics, you said he was unique in that
For him, infinity was not merely a name for interminable extension, so it wasn't just like long, long time. Rather, infinity is also a proper name for the necessary end of all rational freedom. So infinity is not just some thing of physics, it's actually got a moral quality to do with the character of God. Could you unpack that a little bit, his view of infinity?
Yeah, well, I don't think I said he was unique, did I?
You said he was...
because Gregory of Nyssa also...
you said he was picking up on Gregory.
Yeah, right. Just want to make sure I didn't misstate it, because it's possible I write very fast, and it's like, oh dear.
I read very fast too.
Well, he actually says at one point that were God not infinite, it could not be he could not satisfy our natural desire. So for him, a rational desire always naturally longs for the infinite. If we don't, that even God would be insufficient for us if he were just a being among beings. For Nicholas also, the way one is to understand the infinite is also infinite simplicity, in which all possible actuality is enfolded in virtual fullness, and then it unfolds itself, first, in the Trinitarian life, but also unfolds itself in creation. So that all of creation is what he calls the explicatio, the unfolding, of that which is an implicatio, an unfolding in God. So the infinite there is the infinite fullness of all that might be and all that might be known. And it is, even though if we're not conscious of it in every moment of action and thought, if we try to make I spoke last night of infinite regresses, but this is a good infinite regress, a benign one. If we try to make sense of why we desire anything that we desire, we can always find a more eminent or a higher or a more abstract or more general premise, until finally we realize that the very structure of rational thought and desire always already assumes an infinite appetite for the infinite fullness of reality. And that's what he means by the infinity of God.
Yes, and parts of St. Augustine say the same thing.
Yeah, and that's the curious. Nicholas loved Augustine, but he never quotes him from after a certain period. It's very interesting.
Yeah, interesting. This can sound, I guess when, at first blush, it could sound like very philosophical, but what strikes me, and it's even obvious in what you've said about Bulgakov, but this was very personal the vision of God is a devotional work to do. And it's very personal. And
it's all about meditation on a Byzantine icon that had been sent as a gift, that in which uncannily the face of Christ, no matter what direction you looked at it from, was one of those well-painted, it seemed to be looking at you. And this becomes a meditation on how seeking the face of God is how God actually also sees us.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And but he also has this lovely personalizing image or conceptual category of faces and God's as the face of all faces, which is a beautiful thought. Now he goes further. So essentially, let's just summarise. We can find exactly the same thoughts in Augustine, but Augustine didn't develop them. You would argue that polemics distracted him and he got a distorted view. Nicholas took those views and built a whole theological vision out of them. And so he would say to any human being, he would have us say to any human being, I don't know if this is the right thing, I just keep thinking of Bruce Springsteen, everybody's got a hungry, hungry heart. And the hungry heart is a desire for God. It's a desire for God. People would not name it that way, but it's within us that we are all reaching out beyond any intermediate object of desire to what's behind it, behind the tree to, the love of beauty. However, So that's a summary, I guess, of this wonderful view of the will, but he goes further, which is apprehension, not just desire. Summarising it as I see it, he's saying God would not create in us a desire for something, like God's not in the game of frustration, creating for us desire that we can never achieve. Could you comment on that sense of apprehension?
He takes it for granted that what sin is simply the thwarting of what our nature would seek and could seek to achieve. And that in fact our natural end and our gracious end are one and the same. So that there's not, this is a curious thing, this is precisely what became a point of dispute in the next century with the Thomists, is because they wanted to affirm that most people go to hell forever. I mean, this is the real reason. And that makes grace all the more precious for those who get into the gated community. That they had to say, well, but God would be unjust if human nature could be fulfilled only in the vision of the divine nature. Therefore, it must be possible that you could have a rational nature, that it could exist in a state of pure nature without any grace at all and be totally satisfied, because God doesn't owe you anything. He did not. So whatever appetites, if you have an appetite for the knowledge of God, that itself is a gift of grace from outside your nature that's been implanted in you by the superaddition of something called the lumen gloriae.
So if anyone does desire the good, it's a predestined gift of God.
It's an extrinsic gift, so you can't lay any claim on God as a result of that. He did not give you a nature that desires more than a natural end. Now the problem is Nicholas and others had already exposed this as making no sense, because all human natural desire for human natural is possible as rational desires only by virtue of a prior desire for a divine end. So just at the level of phenomenology, this would have made no sense. But it was also, it would be utterly contrary to how Nicholas, and really at least the whole Eastern tradition, and frankly most of the whole Western tradition to that point, had seen the matter, which was that the image of God within us is a real natural disposition to long for God. And therefore, Nicholas sees quite correctly that any artificial distinction between the gifts of grace and the gifts of nature is an entirely contradictory formal claim.
And I think you in Your Gods make the point that this is really becomes an eschatological vision which Paul referred to, and John, when we shall see face to face, we shall know as we are known.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, just the point to make, we've made, probably already made it ad nauseum. For the patristic tradition, for most of Christian tradition, that means that seeing face to face and knowing even as I am known is the proper end of our natures. What happens in the 16th century, in a very sophisticated philosophical language for the Thomists, but in a different kind of language for the Reformed, is that's no longer a given. Grace has become so mysteriously extrinsic to our nature that even saying we're in the image of God doesn't mean anything much other than there's a kind of paradigm, a divine paradigm for rational beings.
So Nicholas's view of sin would say a drug dealer is desiring the good, they're just distorted in how they think they're going to get it.
Yeah, I mean, the distortion can be very great indeed. You can become fixated by way of cruelty, but ultimately your desire, if even only in the trivial sense of that which is good for me, that which gives me pleasure. In a different system, the Scotus system, this is the difference between the desire for that which is commodious and that which is just. And you can go either path in the search for truth, for the search for the good. But in either case, the prior desire for the good is what motivates you to desire anything at all.
So we, in evangelizing, as it were, rather than opening with, let me tell you about yourself and all of mankind, you're a sinner and no good thing dwells within you, we would say, let me tell you about yourself. You're made in the image of God. Every desire you have is actually at heart a desire for the good and for God. You may well be taking wrong pathways to that. You may well be ignorant of it, but in you loving others and in you loving that tree and in you loving music, you don't know it, but you're reaching for the good, and the good is God, which St. Augustine would have said the same thing, I think, in De Trinitate.
Yeah, he would have.
So you could rename, for any human being, an experience of God that's latent and there already. It might be unfulfilled. Well, I think that's a fairly illuminating and clear sort of story. I like, David, I think what you help us so much with is not just the nuances, but the context and history where these, as it were, competing visions by two very great men, Nicholas and two men who both loved God, there's no question of that, but came to, in the end, fairly different conclusions from fairly similar beginnings. And so we're going to take a short break now. You conclude with Nicholas's views that they leave no space at all for what you call the partition of the cosmos into the supernatural and the natural, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next module. So we're going to take a break for about 5 minutes or so. It's not our morning tea break. We just want to give you a chance to stretch your legs and David a chance to drink water and check the baseball scores.